Today we are going to discuss about the historical perspective behind the emergence of neorealism in Italy. In this discussion, we are not going to discuss about specific films. We are not going to analyze films in general, but rather we are going to have a brief overview. We are going to have a very broad overview regarding the socio-economic, political, as well as the cultural scenario from which neorealism kind of emerged in Italy in post-World War scenario. Realism itself is a very loaded term. It is a difficult term to define, and it's also a very important term which most of the eminent film scholars have engaged in various capacities. And obviously, neorealism, as the term in a sort of self-explanatory way, kind of refers to realism in a direct manner. Obviously it refers to different approaches of realism. It refers to different ways of engaging with realism, and in our discussion we'll try to explore what are those approaches, what are those trajectories through which neorealism as a filmmaking aesthetic, as a filmmaking ethics, as a filmmaking process tried to engage with cinema in post-World War Europe, and especially in Italy. Let's first of all begin with a quotation from Giuseppe Bartolucci. In reference to neorealism, he once said that the cinema was born with neorealism. What he actually meant was neorealism proved to be a watershed moment. It was a moment of a point of departure from the previous ways of filmmaking. And it was also a point of synthesis when the past ways of filmmaking, the traditional ways of filmmaking converged with the future tradition of filmmaking. So it is in a way is one of the key moments of the history of cinema in general, and especially in the history of cinema in Italy and Europe. The first time the term neorealism was used was in 1942, and interestingly enough it was used by Italian critic in his criticism of French cinema. Although there are some disagreement about the actual origin of the term neorealism, but obviously it is one of those terms which have been used more often than any other term in film scholarship and film research. But what does actually neorealism mean? There can be different ways of defining neorealism. One can actually look at a series of films, one can actually look at the political dimension, one can actually look at the relationship between filmmaking process and the socio-cultural scenario in that particular period of time. But in general, neorealism to a certain extent refers to a kind of an aesthetic movement, a kind of ethics of filmmaking, which which created a group of film roughly between 1945 to 1955. Although there are several films which actually began a little earlier than 1945, and it obviously continued a little later than 1955. And some of the most recognizable, most identifiable films within neorealism would be Roberto Rossellini's Rome Open City, which released in 1945, Germany Year Zero, 1947, Vittorio De Sica's film like Shoeshine, which released in 1946, Bicycle Thieves in 1948, Umberto D, one of the classics of neorealism, which released in 1951. Again, Visconti, Fellini, and several other directors are credited with making neorealist films. But it would be very problematic to come up with an exhaustive list of neorealistic films, mainly because there are some very important precursors of neorealistic films, especially like Visconti's Ossession, and there are several very important films that followed this particular movement, which had a very visible and identifiable neorealistic traits. But what would be much more important for us is to look at the historical conditions within which neorealism as a particular kind of film aesthetic, as a particular kind of film movement emerged. Before we go into the specificities of that historic period, let me discuss a little about the kind of film that was being made in 1930s, before the initiation of the neorealist filmmaking process. And the film that was that the films that were being produced under the fascist regime was generally a misleading picturization of several historical situations, several historical events, including the rise of the Roman Empire, the Renaissance, even the First World War. The misleading distortion was basically because of an effort towards making those films in line with the bourgeois fascist regime, so that they could actually substantiate their regime with the help of those films. So essentially, those films were propagandist in nature, and there was direct support from the fascist government, and especially Benito Mussolini, who was ruling Italy at that particular point of time. And those films in 1930s, those films also kind of combined different elements from different sources, including the opera, the literature at that particular point of time, even the then contemporary political scenarios, again to make those films in line with their bourgeois high class, in a very luxurious, high class luxurious lifestyle, which was obviously mirroring the fascist mindset in that particular period. And these films were often referred as the white telephone films, mainly because most of these films actually featured the white telephone, which became a kind of symbol of the bourgeois excess, a symbol of the high class lifestyle, the extravagant lifestyle, the grandeur of the bourgeoisie. And this film was often was often features as the center of criticism for a number of film enthusiasts and film critics at that point of time. Now, we obviously know that since 1924, the end of the First World War and the initiation of the Second World War, Benito Mussolini started his rule in Italy. And from 1930s onwards, it is considered that the fascist regime was enjoying its glory days. And within this period, these propagandist films were being made.
Di gente che ignorava la scrittura con la quale tramandare i documenti della propria vita in un tempo in cui Roma aveva Cesare, Virgilio ed Augusto.
At that particular point of time, Italy was going through a transitional phase, not only in terms of politics, but also in terms of economy, because it was also going through a change from the predominantly an agrarian economy to a manufacturing-based economy. And obviously, the people were suffering because they wanted to accommodate themselves within this changing scenario. So it was very difficult for them to make ends meet. And this was the social reality which was not being reflected in the kind of films that were being produced with the support from the fascist regime. So at that particular point of time, although at a very nascent stage, but the anti-fascist resistance was gaining ground, especially from the left-wing parties in Italy, and particularly from the Communist Party of Italy. But it was mainly the literary circle of Italy who were consolidating public opinion against the fascist regime and trying to prove their point through their discussion about literature, through their discussion about poetry, and obviously about their discussion and engagement with film criticism. Two journals are very important in this regard. One is the Cinema, which published in 1936, and another is the Bianco e Nero, which published in the following year, 1937. And in these two journals, some of the most well-known critics, philosophers, theorists, poets, and film enthusiasts, including people like Michelangelo Antonioni, Luciano Visconti, Alberto Moravia, Italo Calvino, even Pier Paolo Pasolini, they were writing about films, and they were actually advocating for a film which would be much more closer to what in Italian called the verismo, or realism, the actual social reality of that particular historical period, and which was essentially missing in the kind of films that were being made. And they were attacking the white telephone films, the propagandist films of the fascist regime, mainly because speaking against the fascist regime, criticizing the government was entirely forbidden for the public. So they were actually criticizing the films which were in line with the fascist ideology, which was in line with the bourgeois ideology, so that they can actually critique the government, their policy, and the way they are treating people.
Vogliamo essere civili e terminati. Sono un funzionario dello Stato, ho fatto sempre il mio dovere. Voglio essere giusto e finito, pentire la mia miseria.
So film in that period became a vehicle. Film in that period, in an oblique manner, became one of the outlets through which people wanted a change, people wanted a transformation, people wanted a resistance from that ongoing atrocities of war, as well as the atrocities of the fascist regime.
Eccoci in una zona del settore centrale, dove è segnalato un movimento di ferite. Una nostra pattuglia veloce sahariana, ricevuto l'ordine di perlustrare la zona, si accinge alla sua missione.
After the war, hardly anything changed in Italy, but people were really looking forward to a change, especially because of the devastation in the First World War and the ongoing devastation in the Second World War. At that particular point of time, the left and the liberal thinkers were at first they were mainly engaged with criticizing the bourgeois, but later on they actually focused more on the social realities and the social circumstances under which the people were suffering, especially after the devastation of the World War. And since the right-wing parties were losing ground slowly, so some scholars sometimes find out a specific Marxist tradition into these films, because most of these neorealist films actually engaged with those protagonists who are representatives of the working class, who are representative of the peasant class, and they were put into very ordinary situations, very everyday situations, and audiences are actually observing what would happen to a real person in a very real situation, within the poverty, within the distress, within the devastation of war. These neorealistic films, the neorealism was reacting, firstly, they were reacting against their own national cinematic tradition, because their national cinematic tradition was in accordance with the fascist regime. The national tradition of filmmaking was basically dominated by the bourgeois ideology, which they wanted to counter and wanted to resist. At the same time, on the other hand, they were trying to resist the wider institution of Western filmmaking process, including the influence of the Hollywood and the commercial popular films, because these films were essentially escapist in nature. They were politically neutral, they did not engage with the social realities, so the actual circumstances, as actual scenarios, were not being reflected in these films. So they were far removed from what was going on in Italy and in Europe in general, in terms of representation. Another incident that kind of invested in the the growth and the emergence of neorealism was the devastation of Cinecittà Studio. The studio, which was founded in 1937 by Benito Mussolini and his son Vittorio, was one of the most important, influential, and one of the most equipped studios in Europe. And most of the propagandist films made under the regime, under the fascist regime, was made in Cinecittà Studio. After the World War, due to persistent bombing, most of the studio was destroyed, and whatever actually remained was ultimately converted to converted into a makeshift shelter for the refugees. And obviously it was not adequate, it was not equipped enough to shoot films within the studio. So what was necessary for any filmmaker at that particular point of time is to go outside and shoot the film within whatever was happening outside. And in that particular historical period, if one is to shoot their film outside, it would be in the middle of the devastation of war. It would be in the middle of the wreckage of the war. So obviously these films, Italian neorealist films, have a very distinct kind of visual treatment, which kind of emerged from the historical situations, which kind of emerged from the economic conditions in Europe and especially in Italy. So what kind of visual elements are we talking about in terms of neorealist films? There are some very identifiable characteristics of neorealism. In general, these films are shot on location. They rarely use any artificial lights. It is mostly natural lights. They use non-professional actors, sometimes semi-professional actors. The narrative is reduced to the minimum so that the focus would be on the subject who would belong to the working class background, and he will be put into a very ordinary situation to see how he will react like any other ordinary person. And it is their endurance, their spirit of humanity, which will ultimately overcome all odds. That is the main narrative structure in a very simplistic terms. But there is one obviously notices there is an apparent objectivity in these films, but also this objectivity in a way runs parallel to a sense of affection, a sense of sorrow of people suffering under the wreckage of war. One of the significant characteristic of this film, which kind of emerged again from the historical condition, is that the films are, in a sense, the narrative in a sense digresses a lot in an informal manner, and they digresses in such a way that the audiences are expected to observe not only the protagonist but also the surrounding of the protagonist, the other characters as well, the kind of situations that they have to confront. And obviously there is this barrenness, this destruction, this emptiness of spaces within these films, which portrays the poor and ruined and apparently devastated characters within a similar kind of devastated and ruined scenario. But ultimately, as I've already talked, that amidst these ruins, ultimately their endurance survives. Rarely in neorealism film one would find an acute depiction of violence. If there is any violence, then predominantly it's an economic violence. And one is obviously reminded of the very famous film Bicycle Thieves by Vittorio De Sica. And in one of the scenes in the film, at the very beginning of the film, we see the main protagonist Ricky is approaching the pawn shop owner, where he has actually pawned his bed sheets and the blankets in exchange of his cycle. And there's this shot where the camera tilts up and we are shown hundreds and thousands of such blankets, such bed sheets, which actually represents the suffering, the similar kind of suffering that the Italians are witnessing after the war. And this again is a kind of violence, but it is an economic violence which has actually resulted after the First and the Second World War. So the neorealists were trying to produce an image that would be so close to the social realities that would actually get rid of the entire mediation of cinematic apparatuses, which was obviously the objective of neorealist filmmakers. Neorealist theorists like Cesare Zavattini would actually argue for a film which would actually get rid of the entire filmmaking process and the people involved with it, so that reality will be represented almost unmediated. And one may argue that this is an unfeasible desire, but what is much more important for us to notice is that it is a desire that the promise for a reconsideration of a cinema history, it's a desire which would obviously refer to a promise that a cinema history would be reconsidered in a different manner. It would actually involve a modification of representation in cinematic form, and obviously the relationship between the spectator and the film would also change with the kind of films that they wanted to make. By the middle of the 1950s, most of the neorealist filmmakers actually shifted their focus and started making different kinds of films. And obviously, like any other movement, it kind of started to fade away. And there was also a burning debate regarding whether all the neorealist films, the films which are generally considered neorealist, whether those films are actually neorealist in nature or not. Because most of the films, in terms of theories and in terms of execution, they did not match. For example, in Rossellini's film, the theory and the execution was quite smooth, but some other films, there were some differences in terms of their ideology and the actual representation on screen. So there was this burning debate whether it can actually be called as a movement, because there is no consistency of the films that have been made under the umbrella term of neorealism. And also the critics were really anxious about the actual reasons behind this, behind the decline of neorealism in the late 1950s. Some scholars argue that it is mostly because the socialist and the leftist intellectuals did not have that kind of a strength in terms of conveying their message at that particular point of time. At the same time, Italy was witnessing a rising increase in their income, so they were actually looking forward to a much more prosperous lifestyle, and obviously the Western films, especially the Hollywood films, were supplying them with the kind of dreams and desires which were in line with the kind of aspirations they were having at that particular point of time. So the audiences were not actually engaged in that manner with neorealist films, which were mainly focusing on poverty and the lack of humanity in a post-World War situation. So, and it is also the case that Europe in general in the late 1950s was actually witnessing a period of a brief creative withdrawal. So there was a fading away of creative energies and different creative practices in that particular point of time. It would be interesting to look at what Cesare Zavattini, one of the formative theorists of neorealism, said regarding neorealism. And as he said, that neorealism has perceived that the most irreplaceable experiences comes from things happening under our own eyes and natural necessity. So obviously, neorealist films try to put forward, represent reality as it is without any kind of mediation, and that is also their ideology as such, because it was a kind of resistance against the escapist and politically neutral cinema. And as Desika pointed out in one of his interviews, that reality is there, why change it? So obviously neorealist filmmakers wanted to affect the reality as little as possible, so that the social reality of post-World War Europe would be presented in almost an unmediated manner. So the content matched to a certain extent with the form, and that ultimately kind of urged the viewers as well as the filmmakers in the future to reconsider filmmaking as such. And it also kind of referred to a changing relationship between the audience and the film itself, and the filmmaking process and the historical situations. So what we are looking at in terms of filmmaking, in terms of history of film, in terms of European history as well as the world history of film, is that if one has to understand neorealism, he has to look at the images that neorealist films create from a specific theoretical perspective, from a specific ideological perspective, and that that specificity of the ideology and theory should be looked at from a specific historical outlook, and that historical outlook is very essential for us because the neorealist filmmakers deliberately and very consciously tried to produce a new kind of consciousness of storytelling, a new kind of consciousness of image making, which reflected in most of their films.